Welcome to the American Historical Association's Congressional Briefing on the History of Federal Science Funding. I'm Alexandra Levy, the Director of Communications and Public Affairs at the American Historical Association. Thank you all for being here today. The American Historical Association, or AHA, is the largest membership association of historians in the world and provides leadership for the discipline and promotes the critical role of historical thinking in public life. The AHA's Congressional Briefings program, now in our 20th year, provide congressional staff, journalists, and others in the policy community with the historical background necessary to understand the context of current legislative concerns. The program rests on the premise that everything has a history, and that includes the issues that face Congress. Our second premise is that historical context is nonpartisan and our briefings are unencumbered with any particular legislative agenda. Our speakers will adhere to that standard. The AHA is grateful to the Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes at Arizona State University and the Sloan Foundation for their sponsorship of this briefing, and to the Mellon Foundation for the funding that makes the briefings program possible. We hope to see you at future briefings and encourage you to email us with any ideas for topics. The AHA has nearly 11,000 members, and we can find a historian to speak on any topic. Recordings of previous briefings are available to watch on C-SPAN and the AHA's YouTube channel. Our 2025 briefings have discussed the history of the House of Representatives and the Senate, the history of deportation, the Federal Civil Service, tariffs, and artificial intelligence. Our next briefing will be on February 11th on the history of vaccines. Our panelists today will present on the history of the federal government's approach towards science and public policy, and how the government has supported and funded scientific research and innovation over time. We are grateful to Arthur for suggesting the topic of this briefing to mark the 75th anniversary of the establishment of the National Science Foundation. I am especially excited for this briefing because before I joined the AHA, I worked for an organization that focused on the history of the making of the atomic bomb in World War II. Learning about that period taught me a great deal about the rise of big science, how federal government support for STEM programs at universities accelerated scientific discoveries and innovation, and the role of federal funding in driving America's global influence in science, engineering, and technology. I look forward to learning from our panelists today about the broader arc of federal support for science. Our panelists will speak for about 40 minutes total, and then we'll have time for Q&A. Please write down your questions on the cards on the chairs, and we'll collect them during the Q&A portion. You have the biographies of our panelists on the handout, so I'll be brief in my introductions. Melinda Baldwin is the AIP Endowed Professor in History of Natural Sciences at the University of Maryland, College Park. Her research examines how scientific authority is constructed and communicated, especially through journals, peer review, and the institutions that define expertise. She is the author of Making Nature, the History of a Scientific Journal, and the forthcoming book, In Referees We Trust, How Peer Review Became a Mark of Scientific Legitimacy. Arthur Daemmrich is director of the Arizona State University Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes, and a professor of practice in the ASU School for the Future of Innovation in Society. His research focuses on innovation, regulation, and the evolution of the federal science and technology policy profession. He previously directed the Smithsonian's Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation, and has held appointments at the University of Kansas School of Medicine and Harvard Business School. Bhaven Sampat is an economist at Johns Hopkins University with faculty appointments at the School of Government and Policy and the Carey Business School, and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His research examines the history and political economy of innovation policy, federally funded research, patent policy, and the U.S. biomedical research enterprise. He has published on how public funding, patent law, and institutional design shape drug development, university industry technology transfer, and long-run scientific and economic outcomes. I will now turn it over to Arthur for his remarks.
Thank you, Alexandra, and delighted to be here this morning. So I want to start us off and really go back in time to the founding of the country, fundamentally. And next year is the 250th to celebrate the Declaration of Independence. I'm going to bring us a little more recent. So in the early republic, so post-1790, we really do see a significant era of technology transformation alongside the design of the new polity and the core institutions of our democracy. And so the US is a country formed in this moment of industrialization. And even during the Constitutional Convention, as the delegates are debating sort of large state, small state representation issues, John Finch, an inventor, is demonstrating a steamboat on the Delaware River. And in fact, several of the delegates walked the 4 blocks down and took rides on the steamboat. And the Constitution in some ways reflected that. So it included this patent clause, which is really quite profound. And interestingly, if you go through the discussion papers of the time, one finds relatively little debate over this. This was kind of written in and then widely accepted. And it specifically states, Congress shall have power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. So the sense prevailed that the federal government should not direct scientific inquiry, but should establish the legal, commercial, and territorial framework in which useful knowledge could advance and contribute to the national improvement. And interestingly, this is a bit of an anecdote, but the first patent issued went to a Philadelphia-based Quaker, Samuel Hopkins, for a new method of making potash and pearl ash. Potash is used as a key fertilizer in early America. And he then did not take this patent and build a business. He instead published a detailed pamphlet on his invention, sought out endorsements, including from the well-known merchant Harry Drinker, as well as the soon-to-be president Thomas Jefferson, traveled around the then frontier areas of upstate New York, Vermont, and rural Pennsylvania, and gave talks about this method, and then licensed it. So he set up the nation's first patent licensing program with the first patent, combining in effect the inventor and the entrepreneur. Federal sponsorship of science in the 1800s then was fundamentally episodic, but did include support for navigation, surveying, and westward expansion. So Thomas Jefferson was a strong advocate of the Lewis and Clark expedition, 1804 to 1806, and helped secure some $2,500 in support from Congress. That expedition, of course, identified several hundred new plant species and mammal species, unique geologic formations, including reports of Yellowstone that frankly were not believed. It was thought they had completely made this up because no one had ever seen geysers before, not a feature prominent in Northern Europe. And above all, documented the lack of a Northwest Passage. A more technologically focused, but still kind of one-off initiative was congressional support of $30,000 in 1843 for Samuel Morse to build a telegraph line from Washington to Baltimore. That was originally operated under the control of the U.S. Postmaster once it worked, but the Postmaster, after a year, said, I don't see a way that this makes any money, and returned it to Samuel Morse, who then established a company that would eventually merge into others and become Western Union. So in addition to those one-off projects, a few core scientific institutions and what today we would call intramural research were established in this period as well. So the coastal surveys established in 1807 to chart the coastline for navigation and defense, typically referred to as the first civilian scientific agency, it did employ scientifically trained personnel and develop measurement standards and mapping techniques. The second major institution in this kind of pre-Civil War era is the Smithsonian. So a major public-private partnership, the first of its kind, established by Congress in 1846, when after 10 years of debate, thinking this was some sort of subversive plot, the US Congress accepted some $500,000 from James Smithson, an English gentleman, bastard son of a formal gentleman. He had inherited this estate, had been more or less driven out of England, and saw in America a knowledge place. So in his will, he said the estate shall be left to the US government to establish an institution for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. This is someone who never set foot in the United States, and yet in that moment sees the United States as a knowledge economy in making. Smithsonian, in fact, then used this funding to do scientific research. Its first secretary builds an electromagnet on display in the American History Museum if you ever want to see it. And then they also, of course, begin collecting specimens for biological research, some 130 million of them, in fact. The mid-19th century sees some significant changes. The growth of agricultural science, so the formation of the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 1862, and the Morrill Act, also in 1862, that establishes the land-grant colleges. So with that, we get agricultural experiment stations and engineering education. We also get a unique development, which is farmers historically have had many children and have tended to divide up the land over time. The U.S. actually accomplishes something remarkable with the land grant in that the sons and children go to college. They get educated. They don't all go, some go back to the farm and bring new methods and techniques, but others enter the economy in other ways. Our farms have tended to grow over time. It's made the U.S. a massive agricultural exporter, but also a heavily technology-based agricultural system out of this connection of the scientific research to the practice of farming. The Civil War also sees other major institutions, notably the National Academy of Sciences, chartered to advise the government, not to fund research, but establishes a link between the growing populace of elite scientists and the federal authority. So science is increasingly institutionalized at this period, but always justified by utility. So it's mapping, agriculture, weather, and minerals. So they're beginning to build a bureaucratic framework for research, but in no way an ideology of basic science funding. The late 19th to early 20th century sees some pretty significant shifts in the professionalization of science, the growth of scientific associations, and then the beginnings of larger scale federal patronage. So in public health, we see the beginnings of medical research. So the hygienic laboratory, established in 1887, would later evolve into the NIH, the world's largest biomedical research facility. It begins as a small public health research operation, and is really aimed initially at developing methods and promoting hygiene. And if you think at 1887 is still an era in which surgeons are frankly proud of having a stiff surgical coat. It's stiff with blood, and it's because they're not washing things the way we would today, right? So these methods and observations developed through this federal science becomes quite fundamental in how we think about hygiene, antibiotics, and medical safety. We also in 1901 get the Bureau of Standards, which would then later evolve into NIST, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. And that's quite fundamental in the federal government supporting metrology, so fundamental measures. And it also operates, interestingly, by selling standards. So to this day, if you want a standard peanut butter, it costs you several $100s as opposed to your cheap jar of Jiffy from the grocery store. Overall, there's a growing sense of scientific capacity as a national asset. But we also have the rise of industrial research in this period. So starting 1900, General Electric sets up the first industrial research lab. By 1917, there's around 1,000 industrial labs across the chemical, electrical equipment, telephone, telegraph, petroleum, rubber, photographic materials, and others. World War I comes as a major shock to the US, and it really leads to disjointed and yet impactful responses. So we get the beginnings of engaging closely with private industry. We get research labs, so the Chemical Warfare Service and the US Navy both become major patrons of science, so they're funding science done at universities, but also especially through contracts. And a National Research Council is established to give some grants and find technology to be useful to the war effort. The US involvement in World War I, of course, is very short, and largely the institutions built during that war dismantled after. I wanted to point to one other, though, is in the midst of World War I, Thomas Edison suggests, let's gather ideas from inventors across America. So by mid-1917, the Naval Consulting Board has received 100,000 proposals. It's generally dismissed then as a failure because they didn't know what to do with them. And some of the proposals were, for example, giant magnets to repel submarines. So like really giant magnets. But some of the inventors did in fact propose ideas, underwater sound detection, smoke screens, alternative fuels and lubricants, that were researched and further deployed. And so there was that sense of sort of the independent inventor is still alive. So key takeaways from this period to transition to my colleagues. So for the pre-World War II period, the federal government established conditions in which individual, independent inventors and scientists could thrive. The federal government did fund some high-risk projects, the telegraph, surveys, land grants for colleges, and land given to the rail system, but was not in the grant-making business. The institutions that remain important today, several of them were established in this period, including the Coastal Survey, Smithsonian, the land grant system, but funding for university-based research was fundamentally by contract within a high-trust community of people who knew each other, who were transitioning between universities and government. And so it's kind of people funding people they know through a contract basis. You do have the formation of the Gordon Research Conferences that brings together scientists from industry, academia, and government into dialogue around where is the research frontier in a particular topic. So they're beginning to kind of form this notion that research has an edge and that we need to identify what that is for our scientific field to advance. But they're not expecting the government to fund it. The efforts to review general submissions basically were totally overwhelmed during World War I. There was no system in place to do so. And so last point, just intramural research that have been established for biomedical science, standard setting, metrics and measurement, food and drug safety. But there's relatively little expectation that the government would be responsible for funding science overall or for supporting diffusion or uptake of the results of science. So with that, let me turn over to my World War II colleague, Bhaven Sampat.
Hard part.
Yeah, all right.
Thank you, Arthur, for helping organize this. Thank you to the HA for inviting me. This is the time to say that, to reinforce that I'm an economist and not a historian. So, in fact, sometimes people call me an economic historian, which just means that the economists think I'm a historian and the historians think I'm an economist. But I'll try to do both. And I'll also say I've heard this story from Arthur a few times, but I pick up a new nugget from it each time. So really appreciated that. I'm going to pick up where Arthur left off and talk about World War II. Arthur talked about intramural research in the U.S. federal government. World War II was really the first time the U.S. federal government funded large-scale extramural research, with some exceptions in agriculture. I'll start with some scene setting. Most of you know this, but just to get us all on the same page. So in June of 1940, as the German armies are marching across Western Europe, the U.S. realizes that it's going to become involved in World War II. And in this conflict, more so than previously, the side with the stronger scientific and technological capabilities would likely have a significant upper hand. And this is both good news and bad news from the perspective of the US. Good news because, as Arthur pointed out, during the interwar era, there were pockets of sophisticated scientific and technological capabilities that had developed across the US. Bad news because there was really no strong federal policy apparatus to support the research, to coordinate the research, to mobilize science and innovation to confront the imminent crisis. So to that end, 18 months before Pearl Harbor, the US federal government sets up the Office of Scientific Research and Development, or OSRD, run by Vannevar Bush, who was formerly vice president and dean of engineering at MIT. Over the course of the war, OSRD enters into north of 2,000 R&D contracts with leading firms and universities across the country at funding levels that are a pittance by today's standards, but orders of magnitude greater than the US federal government had previously spent on supporting research. It's, in some sense, I think, the biggest single funding shock in US history, and at least from the perspective of the US and the Allied cause in World War II, is extremely successful in the sense of helping support the development of radar, atomic fission, the atomic bomb, but also a range of medical technologies, malaria treatments, mass production of penicillin, other things that are well known. I've also done some work with Dan Gross, who's an economic historian at Duke Fuqua, where we've digitized all the old OSRD records, and we find long-run effects of OSRD funding on civilian technology development in the 10, 20, 30 years that follow. Okay, not going to talk about that. So much so that even so successful it is from the perspective of World War II, that even before the war is over, the President Roosevelt asks Bush to reflect on the lessons from this unique experiment to develop a plan for science funding in peacetime. And Bush's response, Science the Endless Frontier, is sometimes called, rightly or wrongly, the blueprint for post-war science and technology policy. His argument in a nutshell, it's actually much more complex, but I'll give you the nutshell version of it, is that we should continue funding of research after the war, with a focus on federal funding of basic research at universities and letting scientists in the scientific community call the shots. So the idea was that there'd be considerable scientific autonomy in how the funds are allocated and how science is practiced. In return for this unusual degree of autonomy, science as a whole would deliver in the form of national security, health, economic growth. Though Bush doesn't use this term, this is sometimes called the post-war social contract for science. Importantly, Bush's report has two audiences. The first is well known. It's taxpayers, making the case to taxpayers, politicians, others that federal funding of research in peacetime could yield dividends, would be in the national interest. But second, to the scientific community, the idea that government funding of science wouldn't compromise scientific freedom or the autonomy of universities, which was a real concern at the time, including among a number of the leaders in the scientific establishment. And those issues actually have arisen again today. Perhaps less well known is that Bush's document was a response to a different vision, a series of different visions, but prominently a different vision of science policy from Bush's nemesis or frenemy during the war, one Harley Kilgore, a senator from West Virginia. Unlike Bush, who's this sort of Boston Brahmin, Kilgore is an old New Deal Democrat, elected on the tails of Roosevelt, and really is initially during the war not concerned about science at all. He's a self-proclaimed scientific ignoramus, but rather problems of economic concentration, monopolies, and things like that. But he begins a series of hearings, a series of investigations. He starts to learn about OSRD, and on one sense admires OSRD, but also expresses some concerns. So some of the concerns are the contracts are highly concentrated in a handful of institutions, including Friends of Vannevar Bush. Right? Second, the independent inventors that Arthur spoke of, they were submitting a whole bunch of proposals for the war, and Kilgore felt that they were being left out to the detriment of the wartime effort. Questions about elitism, questions about patent rights resulting from federally funded research, and whether, as was the case for the majority of OSRD contracts, the title to those patents should be held by the contractors, including big firms at the time. But at the same time, Kilgore viewed OSRD and the wartime research effort more generally as proof positive that government funding of research could yield significant returns in peacetime. He was particularly interested in using government funding to compete with firms to solve problems that the market would not. So the Bush-Kilgore debates. Bush and Kilgore agreed on several things. First, as I've already said, that the era of laissez-faire in science funding was over, that essentially the US federal government would be supporting research after World War II. Second, both visions assumed that there would be a single funder of research after World War II. In Kilgore's was the National Science Foundation, Bush's was originally the National Research Foundation. But there are key differences. I've already alluded to several, but let me just highlight 5. First, around planning. Bush wanted basic research conducted for its own sake. Kilgore wanted research targeted to specific socioeconomic outcomes. He was interested in problems like rural electrification, the water supply and cleanliness, I suppose, of the water supply, some of the hygiene problems that Arthur alluded to. He was interested, I was going through some of his writings recently, of problems associated with phones on trains, which I think were different problems associated with phones on trains than those of us who take the Acela sometime. Second, political control. Bush wanted a foundation run by scientists. Kilgore wanted a more politically and democratically accountable science policy. This played out mainly around issues of the composition of the National Science Board and who would appoint the director. Third, basic versus applied research. Bush essentially wanted federal funding of basic science at universities, leaving application to the market, anticipating economists' market failure theories of funding for basic research. Kilgore believed, though he didn't use these terms, I'll just put those in his mouth now, that there's market failures in applied research as well. So there's a productive role for federal funding on the applied research and development side as well. Fourth, geographic distribution of funds. Kilgore wanted some explicit geographic distribution of a significant portion of funds. And finally, around patent rights, as I've already said, Kilgore really wanted patents resulting from federally funded research to be held by the federal government. Let's just say that Bush viewed it as more complicated. So tying things up, how did the Bush-Kilgore debates shape post-war policy? Interestingly, as I've already said, one thing they both agreed on is that there would be a single foundation funding research after World War II. Ironically, when Bush and Kilgore and their congressional allies are sort of duking it out over the 1945 to 1950 period, something has to happen with all the research that was going on during the war. And essentially what happens is a range of agencies, the mission agencies, absorb a lot of the wartime research. So NIH picks up wartime medical research, the AEC fission research, Army and Navy, some of the weapons research, so that by the time in 1950 the National Science Foundation is finally established, the mission agencies come to dominate federal R&D funding as they do today. But, and so in that sense, the Bush report was a failure, but in broader aspects of that vision stuck, including ideas of the federal government as a major funder of basic research, universities as the main performers of it, and ideas about the division of labor, that the federal government funds research upstream, and we leave the quote-unquote market to do downstream research and development. Looking forward. First, for those keeping score at home, you may notice that a number of the themes in the Bush-Kilgore debate continue to resonate today, and certainly have over the past 75 years. You see them at the NIH, the agency I study the most closely, including questions around whether funding should be allocated by disease burden or according to the best science as judged by scientists. Should funding be channeled through categorical disease institutes, and what's their role versus more investigator-initiated research? How much should the NIH fund basic research versus applied research, clinical trials, and development? How broadly distributed should the funds be? Who should own patents resulting from NIH-funded research that results in blockbuster drugs? All important issues historically, indeed today, and all reminiscent of Bush-Kilgore. Second, the social contract that I mentioned, it's a fragile one, and we're seeing that today. I think that's an understatement. An interesting question to which I don't know the answer is with whether more Kilgorean aspects or approaches to science policy, including more democratic accountability, more of an outcomes or problem-solving orientation, broader geographic distribution, could help build a more resilient, broad-based, durable contract going forward. And third, and I'll wrap it up here by taking off my amateur historian hat and thinking like an economist, what would be the trade-offs associated with that sort of approach? It's remarkable to me how little empirical evidence we have on some of the fundamental questions about alternative approaches to science and research policy. And from my perspective, we need to learn from the last 75, 80 years of history, but also proactively invest in experimentation and data collection to inform policymaking going forward, so we're not having the same debates 80 years from now. Thanks.
Probably smart.
Smart.
Right.
We're like,
Well, thank you all so much for coming this morning, and thank you to Arthur and Bhaven for their remarks. I am going to pick up right where Bhaven left off in 1947 with a song. In 1947, Iowa physicist Arthur Roberts wrote a satirical song called "How Nice to Be a Physicist," a tongue-in-cheek celebration of scientists post-World War II standing with the federal government. "How nice to be a physicist in this our year of grace," his lyrics went, "to see the scornful world at last admit your rightful place." One line from that song declared that physicists needed to think of money only when we wonder how to spend it. And I've always really liked that lyric because I think it very nicely captures the post-war moment in US history of science. For a time, it really seemed as if scientists could not spend money fast enough to suit the federal government. There were always more physicists to be trained, more engineers needed for projects, more discoveries needed to surpass the Soviet Union, and the 1957 launch of the satellite Sputnik really opened the federal government's pocketbook. It felt as if money was flowing almost infinitely into scientific research because it was seen as one of the keys to winning the Cold War. But that moment of seemingly boundless federal spending did not last forever. In my remarks, I'm going to sketch out a couple of important episodes from the 1960s through the 1980s, as scientists and the US federal government faced a changing set of circumstances that led to some major reorientation of federal spending on science. One important early sign that the relationship between scientists and their federal funders was changing was the 1966 Project Hindsight report, issued by the Department of Defense. The report was the result of an investigation into the outcomes of DoD funding for research in the physical sciences. The Hindsight report concluded that, quote, while DoD investment in science and technology has had a large payoff, outcomes were far better when funded and managed by the Defense Department or defense industry rather than the non-defense sector, i.e., it's better if the Department of Defense is running things and not universities or non-defense companies. So that really calls into question a lot of this Vannevar Bush belief about what the benefits will be of funding basic research in universities. The Hindsight report is kind of a reaction to that Bush belief about the likely outcomes of government investment in basic research. The most significant conclusion of the Hindsight report, however, was that outcomes were best when the effort was oriented, i.e., when money was spent on applied research for a specific practical goal, rather than on basic research that just sought to advance knowledge. Although the Hindsight report was specifically about DoD funding, the report led many policymakers to question military and government expenditures on basic research more generally, on the grounds that undirected work seemed less likely to yield direct benefits. The U.S. cultural view of scientists was also changing at this moment. By the late 1960s, skepticism of science was on the rise on both sides of the political spectrum. Left-wing activists were angry about the scale of scientific collaboration with the U.S. federal government during the Vietnam War, and conservatives were angry that left-wing scientists had voted classified research off of campuses such as Stanford and MIT. The combination of changing government priorities and bipartisan disappointment in scientists created the perfect circumstances for cutbacks to science funding. In the late 1960s, for the first time since the end of World War II, federal funding for science began to experience a decline, and that's adjusted for inflation. The consequences of shrinking funding for American science were quick and dramatic. Students who had entered PhD programs in the early 1960s felt confident they would have robust job opportunities when they graduated. In 1962, for example, the placement service at the American Institute of Physics listed 514 jobs for physicists, but only 449 PhDs looking for work. Over the course of the 1960s, however, the number of physicists crept up and the number of jobs steadily dropped. By 1971, the job numbers were outright catastrophic. The placement service registered 1,053 applicants looking for work, but advertised just 53 jobs. Yeah, not great if you're one of those PhDs looking for work. There was also tension in the biological sciences, particularly in biomedical research, as President Nixon's signature domestic policy, the war on cancer, upended the NIH. In 1971, Congress passed the National Cancer Act, which tasked the director of the National Cancer Institute with establishing a national program of cancer research. Between 1971 and 1973, the NCI's annual budget quadrupled. Despite that financial generosity, relations between the Nixon administration and scientists were really far from easy. Many biomedical researchers felt that the administration's pledge to cure cancer was unrealistic. NIH employees and scientists were also worried that the money pouring into cancer research would ultimately be siphoned from other areas of biomedical research. And remember here that the NCI, the National Cancer Institute, is only one of the member institutes of the NIH. The fear of funding cuts came to pass in late 1972, when the administration told the NIH to implement a 10% cut to most of the NIH's non-cancer programs. NIH Director Robert Marston tried to argue against the cuts, and in January 1973, Nixon fired Marston, exercising a provision of the National Cancer Act that made the NIH directorship a presidential appointment. Nixon also eliminated the President's Science Advisory Committee and the position of Presidential Science Advisor. To try to force the NIH to be more supportive of Nixon's policy goals, the Nixon administration turned to the Office of Management and Budget, an arm of the executive branch tasked with overseeing the financial aspects of the president's agenda. In 1973, the OMB recommended that the NIH should be required to abolish its unusual system of reviewing grants, called a peer review process, on the grounds that it should be federal employees and not outside scientists making decisions about how money was spent. I'll note here that the term peer review was actually very new at the time, and the NIH's approach of consulting outside scientists about every research grant was in fact quite unusual. It was also incredibly expensive. It accounts for a huge chunk of the NIH's operating budget. I'd be happy to talk more about the history of peer review during the Q&A because peer review is actually quite a lot younger than most scientists think it is. But the NIH's system was one that scientists liked, and researchers from around the country began writing to their congressmen and senators urging a defense of the NIH's system. Most of Nixon's plans for the NIH vanished as the Nixon administration became engulfed in the growing Watergate scandal. Nixon's successor, Gerald Ford, who took office in 1974, took steps to reintegrate scientific advice into the government, such as signing the Office of Science and Technology policy into existence in 1976. But during Ford's presidency, the U.S. economy was facing major challenges due to an oil crisis, stagflation, and widespread unemployment. The federal government was under intense pressure to cut its budget, and by 1975, several legislators had set their sights on the National Science Foundation as a potential target for cuts. Democratic Senator William Proxmire was particularly effective at gaining attention for his critiques of NSF spending. In March 1975, Proxmire began bestowing something he called the Golden Fleece Award, a badge of dishonor that he gave to what he deemed the month's worst use of taxpayer money. The first two Golden Fleece recipients were actually NSF-funded scientists. Following sustained attacks on NSF grants from Proxmire and others, in July 1975, there was a 6-day congressional hearing on the NSF's grant review system. At the hearing, scientists and legislators came to a broad but remarkably strong agreement that having scientists participate in grant review was crucial for avoiding awards to poorly designed projects or ones based on faulty research. But the NSF's education programs were substantially downsized, and the skepticism of science for science's sake that we saw from Project Hindsight really endured. Gerald Ford's successor, Jimmy Carter, was known for his emphasis on applied research used to solve specific problems, including the use of science to solve environmental issues like hazardous waste site cleanup, and Carter was also known for his championing of renewable energy projects. Carter also championed scientific advice as a crucial part of health and environmental regulatory programs. In the last year of his presidency, Carter signed 2 significant laws affecting intellectual property rights: the Bayh-Dole Act, which allowed scientists to obtain patents based on research done with federal funds, and the Stephenson-Weidler Act, which allowed government employees to earn royalties on inventions and also made it easier to transfer technologies from federal labs to other entities. In 1980, Carter lost the presidential election to California Governor Ronald Reagan, who oversaw a massive reorientation of science funding during his 2-term presidency. Reagan and his science advisor George Keyworth strongly believed that science, including basic science, was crucial for American prosperity, and overall spending on scientific research once again began to increase. However, the Reagan administration had strong ideas about which types of science deserved federal money. The environmental sciences favored by Carter fell by the wayside, as did the social sciences. Keyworth, in fact, would later boast that the Reagan administration had, quote, shown great courage and wisdom in squashing the daylights out of NSF's social science programs. As historian John Remington has put it, the Reagan administration sought to fund science and technology related to a few specific issues: the national economy, corporate success and competitiveness, and military preparedness. That last one received a particular amount of media coverage after the Reagan administration outlined a plan for a space-based missile defense system that famously became known as Star Wars. Another signature Reagan-era initiative was the Superconducting Super Collider, a massive particle accelerator that U.S. physicists hoped would enable them to solve fundamental questions about subatomic particles. Congress approved construction in 1987 at an initial estimate of $4.4 billion for completion. The SSC, however, went massively over budget and would be canceled in 1994 after the estimate for completion had soared to $12 billion. So, they were just a little off. To wrap up, as I hope you've seen from my remarks, and really from all 3 talks, the history of science funding in the U.S. isn't a story of a straightforward journey from point A to point B. Science funding has increased and decreased. Particular fields of science or particular types of science have come into favor only to fall out with the next administration. I hope I've given you a sense of the ways in which the relationship between the federal government and science shifted after the 1960s, and I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you all for those fascinating remarks. I always learn so much at these briefings. So we now turn to our Q&A portion, and please feel free to write down questions on the cards in front of you, and AHA staff will be around to collect them and bring them up to me. While we're waiting on the first question, I'm going to start by asking Dr. Baldwin to talk a bit more about the history of peer review, and then for Bhaven and Arthur to follow up with any insights they have about the history of review of scientific research or patents during the periods that they discussed.
Sure. Let's see. Do these turn on, or should I do something with this? Okay, I'll just try to talk loud. Yeah, how long have we got to talk about the history of peer review? I could take up the rest of the Q&A with this, but to keep it brief, peer review is a lot younger than a lot of people involved with the sciences think it is. The first refereeing systems develop at scientific journals in the 19th century, but they only develop at a specific type of journal. It's a journal affiliated with what we call a learned society, someplace like the Royal Society of London. And you really only see these refereeing systems getting off the ground in the English-speaking world, in the UK and in the United States. So following World War II, when the National Institute of Health becomes the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation gets off the ground, right from the jump, both of those new federal funding bodies incorporate expert advice from outside scientists when deciding which grants to fund. That was unusual. There were a lot of other pots of federal money for scientific research where all of the decisions were being made in-house by federal government employees. And those systems really continue well into the 20th century. So in 1973, when the OMB came in and said, what is this weird peer review system that the NIH is using? It's incredibly expensive. Lots of other people in the government don't use it. Without taking a position on whether or not you agree with them, you can understand where their bafflement comes from, because it was actually a very unusual system as of that time. It's not until much later in the 20th century that peer review is seen as something that's necessary in order to award a credible grant or in order for a journal to be considered scientifically reliable.
Do you want to add any?
No, I'm happy to take more questions. Yeah, I can't add anything to that.
Yeah, just
Okay. Okay. Thank you for the audience questions, and keep them coming. Can you talk more about the Kilgore model and what he meant by democratic accountability?
Is that for me?
Well, start.
Good question. Kilgore, unlike Bush, didn't really have a model. Okay, he in some sense, it's more useful to talk about a Kilgorean approach to science policy than Kilgore's approach. I mean, Kilgore laid out plans over the course of legislation during and after the war. Some of that legislation included things like geographic mandates and questions about patents. The only real kind of democratic accountability, political accountability that was built into the Kilgore proposals, as I recall, was around questions of whether the president should appoint the director of the National Science Foundation or whether it should be basically the scientific community that does so. So that's a specific thing. But we can, and as I said, like he wasn't as sophisticated about science, how science worked, et cetera, as was Bush. And he really didn't, I mean, he had a staffer that worked on these issues, basically. He didn't really have a well-developed plan. But we can think about what that might look like, what a more outcomes-oriented, democratically accountable science policy might look like. But that's not Kilgore. That really came afterwards in the decades that followed.
Let me pick up on that quickly, which is just, by the mid-'60s, there's an active discussion going in science policy circles, so in the academics who are writing and thinking about science policy, about kind of this division of science for policy, policy for science, or in fact, what's identified as the scientific estate, the notion that in order for science to proceed, it has to have like its internal logics. And if you get too much interference coming along with money, the science system won't work. On the other hand, the scientists and the people working on this at the time do grapple with this question of how, why should this funding come? How are we reporting back? What is it we're generating as public goods out of this? And so there's been an inherent tension that people have looked at around, to effectively have an autonomous scientific system does not work in relation to the federal government. So you constantly have this push and pull around that accountability. And it manifests then obviously in highly specific episodes of tension. But it's not something we've fully resolved, and I think it's very much a piece of this year's discussions.
And just to connect that with some of the remarks that were made about peer review, I mean, one of the ways, for example, one of the things that the NIH has thought about over the years is whether in the peer review process, whether on study sections, we should have lay people involved, right? Whether we should have patient advocates involved or it should be the scientific community. I view that as a kind of Kilgorian idea. And again, I don't think it's been properly evaluated, but that's the kind of spirit of a Kilgorian idea.
What was going on in other countries in the post-World War II era that can help us appreciate the U.S. model more?
Oh, boy. Well, I think one reason that the U.S. was really primed to step into the position of world scientific powerhouse after World War II is that a lot of the traditional scientific powers were really devastated by the war in a way that was not true for the United States. Germany, I think, before the war was the unquestioned world #1 in physics. Chemistry too, yes, absolutely. Brain drain caused by the Nazi civil service rules, brain drain caused by people just fleeing wartime conditions, general devastation to infrastructure at universities and government laboratories. It took Germany a very long time to recover their scientific standing. And in the meantime, the United States had welcomed a lot of those emigre scientists. A number of them worked on the Manhattan Project. And the United States was really poised to capitalize on the moment, and I think they absolutely did.
I mean, if we go a little further, I mean, we heard about the Bayh-Dole Act and Stevenson-Weidler and whatnot. In some sense, that's a response to a concern that the U.S. federal government had been funding at levels more so than other countries, significantly funded scientific research. But countries like Japan, Japan Inc. in particular was the concern, had different models of science policy, but more so technology and industrial policy, and there was concerns about U.S. competitiveness, et cetera. And the idea emerged, and I'm not saying if it's right or wrong, that the idea emerged that part of the reason why is that we were actually following a sort of Kilgorian approach at many agencies, not all, where the patents were held by the public sector, or at least it was very, very hard to commercialize those patents. And that is, Bayh-Dole, Stevenson-Weidler, and related initiatives are sort of a response to that. So there is this kind of dialogue with or kind of back and forth with what's going on in other countries.
Let me just add one point on, since you raised Japan. I think that's a very important case to look at right now, which is in the course of the 1980s, the kind of peak of sort of Japan is eating our lunch and will destroy our economy. And I mean, I grew up in Detroit, so I saw what happened in the 70s. To the U.S. auto industry as a result of inexpensive but actually very well-made Japanese imports. So in the concerns with Japan, there's actually a very focused effort to understand the Japanese model and to understand MIDI, which is this institution in Japan, a government agency that does this bridging function between scientific research and industrial application. And if you look, for example, at China today, I think we're doing a less successful job within the government of studying what works in the Chinese model, and we're making sort of broad brush assumptions about what's happening there without a more nuanced understanding. With the Japan MIDI case, there were a lot of efforts to introduce more industrial planning in the federal government. At some level, it's actually a success story that we didn't, in the sense that we did pass Bayh-Dole. We had a number of other things that kind of accelerated U.S. competitiveness, but we didn't create like a full-on industrial planning process. And there's been this tension through the post-war period of sort of technocratic planning versus American chaos that then through a free market economy leads to pretty good outcomes, but not necessarily for everyone.
Following up on that, can you speak to the pros and cons of the Bayh-Dole Act in terms of the U.S. economy and scientific advancement?
Oh boy.
I mean, Bhaven's written a lot on it, but I don't know. Do
You know,
have
I think
that?
I'm gonna punt that to Bhaven because that feels like an economist question.
There are pros and cons to the Bayh-Dole Act. So before Bayh-Dole, it was very, very hard. So going back to World War II, because we had different agencies, essentially, not one single agency, different agencies had different patent policies with respect to who owns the title to patents resulting from federally funded research. So on one hand, like the main, a big thing that Bayh-Dole does is creates a uniform federal patent policy, and that was something that the U.S. federal government aspired to since at least the 1960 Kennedy Memorandum on Presidential Patent Policy. So it kind of makes the policy standard and reduces confusion. And in that sense, I think it's actually quite successul. Second, it used to be hard. You had to go through various, at certain agencies, in particular NIH, also at NSF, in order to patent and in particular exclusively license a patent resulting from federally funded research. You have to go through a series of hoops and red tape. And I think Bayh-Dole eliminated a lot of that and essentially just gave universities title and allowed them to issue exclusive licenses basically reasonably easily. There has been a significant growth in patenting and licensing in the decades since Bayh-Dole and university-based economic activity. I think one can and should ask the question of how much of that is due to Bayh-Dole and related initiatives versus other factors, and I've written a little bit about that. But I think the downside, the potential downside of Bayh-Dole is that it, whereas in a sense before Bayh-Dole it was very hard to patent. After Bayh-Dole, a number of universities, and I think they've gotten better about this, by the way, over the last 10 years or so, but a number of universities kind of very aggressively got into the patenting game and asserting patents, and it was not always about technology transfer, but about patents and accumulating royalty income, et cetera. And I think that's one of the concerns folks had about Bayh-Dole. And the other thing I'll say is that economists who have looked at this, patents in general work very differently across different kinds of industries. So even if Bayh-Dole, we could say, was a big success in the pharmaceutical arena, it may play out differently in like IT, it might play out differently in AI. And so this kind of uniformity may not be the best approach to thinking about patent policy in general.
So just one quick addition. So I've gone back this year and read some of the older writings in science policy. And so in the 1960s, if you read about technology transfer, that term is used. There's fundamentally, in a lot of the publishing on this, so Harvey Brooks is a notable scholar in this area, there's almost no mention of patents at all. It's about universities and industry collaborating and figuring out better manufacturing techniques. It's more about tacit knowledge transfer. So the university in relation to local industries is playing a very different role. Once it all gets funneled into the intellectual property domain, there's a very advantage to that in clarity of transaction, clarity of licensing agreements. It's a real success model, but it also focuses the work of the scientists and researchers at universities on a specific intellectual property claim, as opposed to other forms of manufacturing knowledge that may not be patentable, but are actually very important to advance and develop.
Right. Technology and knowledge transfer becomes equated in some sense with patenting and licensing, whereas there is a much broader set of things that universities can, should, and have done, including the land-grant universities around those activities. By the way, since there are historians in the room, I think December 12th, 1980 was the, is that tomorrow? Is that, the 45th anniversary of Bayh-Dole, yeah.
Well, that was a nice coincidence then. So what can the discussion here today share in terms of parallels with historical How can we think about the historical similarities between past debates over federal science funding and issues today or the state of federal funding today? It's a big question, I know.
It is a big question. With current debates over who should be deciding which grants get approved, I see a lot of resonance with the Nixon-era debates over grant making at the National Institutes of Health specifically, because Nixon and his administration felt very strongly that the NIH was not doing enough to support the president's agenda. And Nixon wanted to bring in more political appointees to sort of exercise greater control over which grants were being made at the NIH. And I think that there are similar suggestions certainly being floated. There have been some executive orders indicating that the current administration would like to do something similar, not just at the NIH, but at funding bodies across the federal government. So that's definitely one parallel that I've seen.
I'll very quickly. I mean, as I said in my remarks, I mean, I think a lot of the debates we have now, in some sense, rhyme with aspects of the Bush-Kilgore debates. I think, one thing I didn't say, but I will say is I think the system that evolved, I don't think it was designed, but the system that evolved at a high level, extremely productive, and in some sense, the envy of the world. The benefits not always evenly spread in terms of the health benefits or the economic benefits. And I think there is recognition that there are pathologies in the system, and this is where I'll try to answer the question. And some of those are kind of Bushian pathologies, including, does the peer review system adequately reward breakthrough research? Can we do peer review at scale? Questions about replicability, et cetera, but also Kilgorean considerations. So we have an enterprise, going back to the Bayh-Dole questions, that can generate a lot of drugs, but they're not affordable to a lot of people, right? And there might be a certain rich get richer aspect to the current system. So in that sense, I think we have to keep all those things in mind as we think about the system going forward, but in particular, the first, that it is a quite productive system at the aggregate. And as we think about reform, I think that's an important thing that we want to keep in mind in terms of our approaches to reform and rebuilding going forward.
I think the other broad brush way to think about the current year in relation to history is around what people term the social contract for science. And that implies that, in exchange for federal funding, the knowledge produced out of the scientific enterprise, which has become heavily university concentrated, although also we often forget we have major national research labs and other federal, in fact, science that happens and continues to happen. But the core principle is, out of that come goods that become knowledge that turns into technologies that drive economic growth, health products that increase our health, and national security. So there's something very nice about the kind of clarity and simplicity of that. To call that a social contract says it's not a written contract. It's an agreement of trust on both sides. And what's interesting is right now we have this question of, where's the public's role in that? No one's ever sat down and asked the public, what do you want science to support in your life? The assumption was, they want national security, economic growth, and health goods. But we need to actually carry out a dialogue and listen to what the public in different parts of the country sees this support generating, in order to begin to think about what a new social contract can be, ideally to generate more public trust in the knowledge that comes out of the scientific enterprise.
And if I can just pick up on that, Arthur, I really feel like peer review gets baked into that social contract at the end of the 20th century. That one of the outcomes I see of the debates about NIH grant making and NSF grant making is that scientists say to the public, to legislators and to members of the public, one of the reasons that you can trust us is that we're not just going to hand out money to everyone who asks. We are going to make sure that these proposals get run through experts in the field. They're going to tell us whether this is viable, whether this is high quality science, whether the people proposing this have the expertise to do it. You can trust, we will honor the social contract in part by relying on this peer review system to make sure that we are funding high quality proposals.
But right now, of course, we see the criticism that that's become a like closed loop and is supporting certain things and not other edge science that people feel, really needs support.
Yeah.
This will be the last question, and then I'll ask the panelists if they have any final comments before we close. Are there also any parallels to what, or themes to what has been defunded in terms of grants over the whole arc of this history?
So I can do a quick one to start and then have my colleagues join, which is just, Melinda mentioned the Carter era work on alternative energy and alternative fuels. And so Carter had actually set up in that time an office within the Department of Energy around energy demonstration. The Biden administration set up the Office of Clean Energy Demonstration. Reagan came in and said the government's role should be in basic science and not in meddling into the market, and so eliminated that Carter era agency. And similarly, the current administration said, clean energy demonstration projects, again, sort of let the market solve this, and this isn't something the government should be involved in. So we have seen, that kind of oscillation more than once in the history.
Social sciences, I think, has undergone a similar oscillation that in the immediate post-war period, social sciences were not initially included in NSF, for example. They weren't seen as real sciences in the same way that biology, chemistry, physics were. Eventually, social sciences get added to NSF. Lyndon Johnson, big advocate of using social sciences to study things like poverty and how to solve it. But then social sciences comes under attack in 1975 by people who don't believe these are real sciences. Carter brings them back into favor again. They fall out of favor with Reagan. So a lot of oscillation for sociology, psychology, and economics. I'm sorry, Bhaven.
I'm a historian today. Just echoing something. I mean, the priorities have ebbed and flowed. What do you call them? Cuts or not? I mean, and that's just been the way it's gone over the last 75 years. And there are very interesting parallels, in particular with the Nixon administration and the OMB, I'm glad you're writing about that. There are some parallels there. I mean, I do think that I'm not a historian, but I mean, there is a certain aspect of what's going on right now that seems, at least to me, qualitatively different in terms of punishing research universities, punishing science for things unrelated in some sense to the science enterprise. And I think one needs to say that out loud, at least to have a discussion about that. So there are some things going on now that very much rhyme with science policy and debates in science policy historically, but there are some things that seem to me to be qualitatively different.
Any final comments or remarks before we close?
So I have one. Okay, so moments of disruption like this are also opportunities at new institution building. And so if you look at, what you heard in our history, I think there were moments into the 19th century where there were significant changes made that generated very, timely outcomes. The post-World War II period, incredible growth, the retrenchment in the 60s, and yet the system kind of by then was becoming pretty stabilized. Even we talked through the Reagan era, but that didn't fundamentally change sort of the institutional matrix. The end of the Cold War was a moment of real retrenchment and real rethinking, and yet again, not actually significant institution innovation. Kind of the key things, the NIH, NSF or extramural, all these agencies that fund their own science, Department of Ag's role doesn't change. And so right now, we actually have an interesting opportunity to do some fundamental redesign. And so it's, I do see a very hopeful path forward in, having the scientific community and the institutions actually function better in relation to our democracy.
And I just add to that I think that there was a similar kind of reckoning at the end of World War II as science funding expanded. So the song that I quoted at the beginning of my talk was not entirely a celebration. One of the couplets said, "If you find a fact essential, classify it confidential. The FBI's approval must be sought." And Roberts was really expressing some hesitation about the level of secrecy and accountability to the federal government that physicists were now expected to have because they were taking this federal money. That was also the McCarthyist moment, where to talk about that rhyming again, that was also a moment when there were scientists being driven out of federal research labs and university research labs for reasons that didn't really have anything to do with the quality of their research. Yeah, I think that's my closing thought. More Arthur Roberts.
Are you going to sing it?
No, no one wants that.
All right, well, thank you to everyone for your thoughtful questions. For those of you who didn't get your questions answered, I'm sure the panelists would be happy to speak with you individually after we close. I also want to encourage all of you to go to the table outside the doors and pick up the handout from today, which will also be available on the AHA's website, along with stickers, pens, and information about the American Historical Association's work. We hope to see you at future congressional briefings hosted by the AHA. Our next briefing will be on the history of vaccines on February 11th. Thank you all for being here today, and please join me in thanking the panelists.